Get yourself a good cup of tea, sit down and relax. You are in for a bit of information concerning acronyms. The information landscape has been littered with letters, and I'm going to take it upon myself to create some kind of clarity for you in this Ukraine conflict. Now, some of you will know every single one of these, in which case, don't tune out, just carry on watching. You've got nothing better to do. Some people know none of these, in which case, be ready to be informed. Some might know a few of them, and you might want to guess whether you know the next one or not. Make it a game. Anyway, this is about clearing up confusion over acronyms. Where should we start? Well, we'll start by getting rid of my ugly face, so goodbye to me. And here's an example of a single tweet from Ukraine Weapons Tracker that has BMP, ATGMs, FPV, heat. What do those letters mean? FGM there, I think it's just a model number, so I'm not going to include that one in my highlights. But when you are surveying all of these places online or in print media or wherever, there are so often acronyms that confuse us. Print media is usually and mainstream media sources are usually pretty good at giving you definitions to these when they first use them. But if you're surveying social media to the extent I do, sometimes these acronyms are just thrown around with wild abandon. It can be confusing. Well, let's start with OSINT itself. Open source intelligence is what I'm involved in. It's what all my sources I use are involved in. I'm a kind of aggregator and communicator. But there are actually 6 components to this. I won't read all to you, but it's interesting to consider actually all of these are open source intelligence sources. The media, print newspaper, radio, TV, internet itself is just as a whole, public government data, professional and academic publications, commercial data, grey literature like technical reports and working papers. These are all components of the overall picture of open source intelligence. You don't need to go to the front line to see for yourself because you potentially have access to all or some of these. And these are open sources of intelligence. OSINT. Right, next we're going to look at armored vehicles. And in fact, there is actually an acronym to give you the whole family of armored vehicles, armored fighting vehicles, AFVs. But that actually includes everything. You don't see that term as much as the others I'm going to give you, but that would include tanks, SPGs, IFVs, APCs, MRAPs, and all of these beautiful acronyms that I'm going to be explaining. So an IFV, that's the first one, is an infantry fighting vehicle. Some people get annoyed when others call these like light tanks or something. I mean, they're not. They're not. Tank purists will have a right paddy at that. But these are essentially sort of armored vehicles, armored personnel vehicles, you could say, but with weapons of a heavier variety than you might find on an armored personnel carrier, and we'll come to that in a second. IFVs are almost always tracked and have some kind of fairly decent bit of kit to either some kind of autocannon or, as you can see with the German one in the bottom right here, some kind of missile system, maybe a TOW or something on top. So they can do some damage and they can also carry a few people and get around fairly niftily. The BMP up the top there, I'm not going to tell you what BMP stands for because it's Russian and you won't remember it. It's not important. That's come in sort of BMP 1, 2, 3 different iterations. This first one, BMP 1, has been around for goodness knows how long, 60 years or so. And that initially was designed to be amphibious, to be resistant to radiation. And there it is. It's still being used, but somewhat outdated compared to some of the other equipment you might see on the battlefield in Ukraine. So that's an IFV. That's a really common one, IFV. And then we're going to get on to APC, an armored personnel carrier. And you'll notice a really important part of this definition here, which is armored, is spelt correctly. So sorry, Americans, you're wrong. I'm merely jesting. Actually, technically, Americans are more correct. I think we made our language a bit French, historically speaking. In fact, the Americans went to America with, as I understand it, how we originally spelled things, and then we changed it all around. So technically, the Americans are correct, but don't let me. I'm not going to say that again. Anyway, I digress. APC. Armored personnel carrier. These are generally wheeled vehicles that are armored, fairly well armored, and can have some weaponry on them as well. But wheels are advantageous for speed. Tracks are advantageous for negotiating more difficult conditions. Mud, particularly, you're spreading your weight over a larger surface area, technically. So they are, those are the comparative advantages. The more wheels you have, obviously, the more maneuverable you are in spreading your weight over further points. But nevertheless, that's an APC, armored personnel carrier. A type of APC, I guess, would be an MRAP. MRAP is a sort of American. It was an American project, I think, started in 2007, where they're like, right, we've seen that our APCs and IFVs get sort of blown up quite easily with IEDs. Oh my goodness, there's one I haven't included in here. IED, which is an improvised explosive device, and you might see them on the side of the road or a mine itself. And vehicles were getting hammered by these IEDs in Iraq and elsewhere. In terms of the British, we used to love our Land Rovers, but they were pretty poor at keeping the crews safe inside, and they were getting blown apart. So something needed to be done about that, and along came the MRAP, which is a mine-resistant ambush protected vehicle, much heavier armor. You can see the Humvees as part of that. Certain Humvees they come in different configurations, right? But you can see next to the Humvee, which you might think is a pretty big vehicle, some of these MRAPs can be fairly sizable, quite high off the ground, and sometimes with sort of shaped like a V shape underneath to have explosions glance off them more. There are different sort of ways of developing these vehicles. Same for APCs in general. But yeah, that's an MRAP, mine resistant ambush protected vehicle. An SPG, another type of AFV, an armored fighting vehicle. An SPG is a self-propelled gun, or howitzer. Howitzer is a word that came from Czech, I think, originally through German, and then came to us as howitzer, which is a cannon. But the thing about a towed cannon is you have to tow it, so you need another vehicle, and then you need the crew to disconnect it, set it up, fire it off. But then if there's really good counter battery fire, then they can work out where you're firing from by calculating the trajectory of the ordnance and work it sort of backwards to find out where you are, and then fire howitzers back at you or artillery back at you. And if you have a towed gun, you can be quite slow to hook it back up. You might want to fire an extra round or two or three, and then before you know it, you've been hit by counter battery fire. Well, SPGs have the advantage of shoot and scoot. They can fire, they can move, they can fire again, they can move, they can fire again. It's relatively simple to fire and move. Here you have track varieties up the top. You've got a Panzerhaubitze 2000, a German one, which is supposed to be one of the best in the world, but not quite designed to be fired as much as it has been in Ukraine. So they've had a few maintenance issues with them. This bottom left is a AHS Crab. Poland, I think, has provided a lot of those to Ukraine. And on the bottom right, you've got the Caesar, which is a wheeled variety. And that's a French piece of kit, which has, I think, the longest range of them all. And in fact, I believe they put these on barges to hit Snake Island because they needed just that. The Caesar already had a pretty good range, but they needed to get it a little bit further. So they whacked a bunch of them on barges and fired them from barges. So that's pretty impressive innovation. Anyway, those are SPGs, self-propelled guns. Let's move on to some of the shells they might fire. Now, I could have listed about 15 different shells here, but I haven't. So just 5 of them. You've got AP, armor piercing shell, so something like the top left, and that would be designed to pierce the armor of tanks specifically. High explosive, HE. HEAT, heat, are high explosive anti-tank um, shells. You've got RAP, which are rocket assisted projectiles, and you got BB, which are base bleed. Base bleed, like the top right, give you a little bit of extra range, a bit like the rocket assisted projectiles, by shooting out some gaseous stuff out the back. Um, and sometimes you might even have little fins come out of them as well, and it gives you a bit of range and maybe a bit more accuracy. Or fins won't give you extra range necessarily, but they might give you extra accuracy. So base bleed, that is that. Anyway, there are 5 different types of shell for you. Okay, let's move on from ordnance to, well, actually, kind of still talking about that, or at least the things that fire them, missiles. The MLRS is a multiple launch rocket system, and that will send up rockets like you can see at the bottom left here, which is a BM-21 Grad. You might have a Smirch, other ones like that. They will fire sort of ballistic rockets, which are the rockets that are going to use physics, and you're going to fire them off at a certain rate and point them in at a certain angle, and they will land at a certain place, you hope. And you keep your fingers crossed that physics still works. So that's your rockets, whereas missiles have the ability to have some kind of maneuverability associated with them. So the GIMLRS, the GLMRS, is a guided multiple launch rocket system like the M270 up here, and the HIMARS on the bottom right. And guided multiple launch rocket systems do what they say on the tin there. They fire rockets that can be guided. Um, and the HIMARS is a form of GIMLRS. That the difference between, say, the HIMARS, the M142 HIMARS, and the N270 is merely that it's on wheels, so it can shoot and scoot with greater ease. It can rock up on the side of a road, fire off its rockets, and then shoot off again. I showed you a video of that happening, I don't know, a few months ago now, where just within a minute, this thing had fired it off its rockets and then shot off. Like the whole thing lasted, what, a couple of minutes maybe. Um, it's just incredible. And the wheels allow them to do that more quickly. There are fewer rocket pods on them than the M270. And quite often people, and I'm very much victim of this, just call both of these things kind of HIMARS. In the media, HIMARS has become this kind of word that represents, firing off these rockets that have X amount of range. Well, actually, HIMARS and M270 can broadly fire the same sort of rockets. I think HIMARS has the ability to change to um, maybe a few larger rockets and have a wider range of things they can fire. ATACMS, for example, is an Army tactical missile system that has a 300-kilometer range, as opposed to, say, 84 kilometers of the normal sort of rockets that we see released by these M270s and the HIMARS, and at the moment in Ukraine. And the call has been for America and other places to somehow provide Ukraine with ATACMS on longer range rockets. There is a Turkish version of GIMLRS that is supposedly being given to Ukraine. We just haven't heard any news since they were given. We don't really know how many they've got. But when we saw, as from my frontline update today, that Henichesk was hit, or the spit near there, and you're thinking that's maybe 150 kilometers away, and these Turkish ones have 150-kilometer range. You're thinking, well, maybe that was used to do that. But anyway, those are MLRS, GIMLRS, and HIMARS, firing potentially ATACMS. Let's stay on missiles here. So these are MANPADS, Man Portable Air Defense System. So MANPADS are shoulder-held kind of rocket launchers, if you like, that fire off missiles, as opposed to rockets, I guess, missiles that have some kind of guidance system that can take out aerial targets, from fixed-wing planes to helicopters to UAVs to drones. And these things can fly at quite a rate. And of course, they need to in order to be able to hit a jet. But they've even taken out, I think, cruise missiles. Um, so yeah, these are pretty useful bits of kit. There in the top left, you've got a Stinger on which is the American one. As with all national media, they will sing the praises of their own country's weapons. So at the beginning of the war, it was all about Stingers. It was all about Stingers and Javelins because the American media is the most prevalent media in the world, and they were saying how wonderful Americans were. In the British media, you heard a little bit more about NLAWs and Starstreak. So the one up on the right here is a Starstreak, and you get Martlet rockets as well, and these different ones that have slightly different capabilities, but generally they do broadly the same thing. Actually, these have been around for a long time, the Stingers. Uh, yeah, so you will hear, depending on what oh dear, my fingers, depending on what country you live in or what media you watch, you will hear about different pieces of machinery, depending on what the biases are. And down here we've got FPV drone, which is a first-person view drone, and that is a drone that you are seeing in the direction it's flying. And sometimes you see these FPV drones. Here's one with a camera right on the front. I showed you that racing drone that went straight into that sort of bunker or that trench network yesterday. That was a first-person view drone. And I've kept that there actually because I thought, I might as well do a whole load on drones because we've got UAV, UGV, USV. So UAV is an unmanned aerial vehicle. So that is your drone as you would normally call it, a drone that flies in the air. A UGV is an unmanned ground vehicle that drives along the ground. We haven't really seen these used in the war, but I think you will start to see these become more and more prevalent as the years go on. It's just the case. They exist. The technology is there, and they have been designed and created. The reason you probably haven't seen them so much is because they just haven't quite worked out, the technology enough yet to make them really useful. But certainly mine clearing vehicles and IED, detonations and stuff like that, they can be useful for that. USV is an unmanned surface vehicle, sometimes called unmanned surface vessel or uncrewed surface vessel. So that's a USV, it's just different words for the same acronym. Sometimes ASV, ASVs, I put an S on there, ASV, autonomous surface vehicle. So it can be an A there. So these, we saw that with the attacks on a couple of different attacks on vessels in Sevastopol. The Ukrainians claiming that they had created them themselves. I know the British gave them some, and I'd be interested to see whether they originally came from the British or not. I guess we'll find out in about 10 years' time. Okay, let's move on to firing things a bit similar to man-pads. These are ATGMs, anti-tank guided missiles, and they are fired from the shoulder again. The American one up the top left is Javelin. The one on the bottom right is an NLAW. So NLAW is a next generation light anti-tank weapon. Some of these have some of these can have quite different ways of blowing up tanks. So, I mean, there are other ones as well. Loads of these have been given from different nations. From a lot of particularly European nations have given their own variations of these. Sorry, I've only given the US and the UK versions. But some of these will try and penetrate the tank straight on. Some of them will fly above and explode above it. Some of them will go down through the weakest part of the tank at the top. So there are different ways that these can work, but they take out tanks. They are anti-tank guided missiles, ATGMs. The sort of more the old school version of these, with a lot less technology, but can still do some damage to tanks. Maybe some of the older versions will struggle to do damage to newer tanks. You get RPGs, rocket propelled grenades. Sometimes you think of these with on the shoulders of terrorists and things like that, or militia in other countries, and whether it be the Taliban or Al-Shabaab or whatever, but actually these have got fairly wide usage. And there are, as I say, there's a great range of capabilities of these depending on, how old school they were or not. And how big the warhead is. This is a warhead we saw on that FPV drone, that racing drone, that hit the bunker, or that hit the trench yesterday that I showed you. So they just chopped the end of the war, or took it apart and strapped the warhead to the drone. Okay, let's keep on flying ordnance. We've got surface-to-air missile systems here, SAMs. So a SAM is a surface-to-air missile system. NASAMS is the Norwegian, or national, depending on whether you're from Norway or from America. This was a collaboration between Norway and America. The Norwegian National, or National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System. So the NASAMS has at least a couple of those systems out in Ukraine at the moment, doing really good work, having very good interception rates. However, these things are expensive, and their missiles are expensive. And here's just one example of a missile that can be fired, even though it was originally designed to be an air-to-air missile, so fired from a plane to another plane, for example. Is an AIM-120 AMRAAM. So AMRAAM stands for Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, but AMRAAMs can be fired from NASAMs, for example. I just wanted to give you more letters. And there you go. There's, 6 letters in one. Brilliant. More flying ordnance. So JDAMs, Joint Direct Attack Munition. Joint because I think it was a collaboration between the US Air Force and the US Navy. And these are ways of adapting dumb bombs so that they have a little bit more range. Just read out a little bit from the Wikipedia entry. When installed on a bomb, the JDAM kit is given a GBU. I copied and pasted this because it had extra acronyms I could give you. The JDAM kit is given a GBU, guided bomb unit identifier, superseding the Mark 80 or BLU, bomb live unit, nomenclature of the bomb to which it is attached. In other words, you get a dumb bomb and you give it a guided unit, which gives it the ability to be guided, but also extra range. So the JDAM is not a standalone weapon, rather it's a bolt-on guidance package that converts unguided gravity bombs into precision guided munitions, PGMs. The key components of this system consist of a tail section with aerodynamic control surfaces, a body or strake kit, and a combined inertial guidance system and GPS. Global positioning guidance control unit. Now, what dumb bombs do is you drop them from a plane. So I'm back here, and you've got my face now because I'm going to do some hand movements. So a plane will drop a bomb, right? And if a plane's going quite quickly in this direction, as it drops a bomb, the bomb is not going to go straight down, right? The bomb is going to, because of physics and I don't know, momentum, inertia, whatever. Someone far cleverer than me can let me know. The bomb will go in, will have slightly more range than just falling in the exact place it was dropped, or below the exact place it was dropped. Now, the higher you go, and the faster you're going as a plane, then actually the greater the range your bomb has. And all of this is calculated so that it will hopefully hit the target. As a dumb bomb, it will hit the target, taking all of those physical variables into account. Now, with a JDAM, what you're doing is you're putting fins on the back, and a bit of this and a bit of that, and a bit of guidance, and not to say that normal bombs won't have fins, but you're changing the way it kind of flies through the air, and to some extent, you can also give them kind of guidance, so that they can, adapt and move to a target. And in fact, I don't know that these have been given to Ukraine, but there was talk about the ability for some JDAMs to be able to hit moving targets. So anyway, you're adding to the range here, but the problem for the Ukraine with the JDAMs, and these are great because it's a cheaper way of getting greater range and more accurate ordnance. Problem is, to get more range off these, you've got to fly higher and faster. Now, if you're flying high, more likely to be found by enemy radar and taken out of the sky. So there's a risk involved in using JDAMs effectively. Thing with using JDAMs, say the American Air Force and Navy has developed these. If America went to war, they would 100% make sure they've got air supremacy first. But neither Ukrainians nor the Russians have air supremacy, so the airspace is contested. Therefore, using these things really effectively is perhaps challenging because you are liable to be hit by anti-aircraft munitions. Anyway, there you go. That's a JDAM for you. Still be really useful because you can still fire them from some way back behind the lines and hit things near the front line. So say Bakhmut, say that you want to hit some, because some of these pieces of ordnance are, £1,000 bomb or whatever, or more, £2,000, I think. You can do some serious damage with some of these bombs. So to drop them on sort of trench networks in and around the front line from say 15 kilometers behind the front line, or 15 miles behind the front line, you are going to have some great effect on what goes on there, much more than an artillery shell or a mortar round will do. So I think they can be used really effectively. It just, you have to think carefully about how they do that, which of course they will do. Anyway, let's get rid of my face and go back to the next slide, which is GLOC, a ground line of communication. So a ground line of communication, or communications, is the route that connects an operating military unit with its supply base. Supplies and reinforcements are transported along the line of communication. Therefore, a secure and open line of communication is vital for any military force to continue to operate effectively. In other words, like HIMARS have been doing, you hit these railway junctions, you hit these lines of communication, bridges, a Kerch bridge, that is taking out GLOCs. And if you take out these ground lines of communication, then an army can't be supplied with its necessary supplies like ammunition, food, fuel, all these sort of things. And they, a, a piece of artillery is useless if it has no shells. Okay, so GLOCs are super important for being targeted, and I think the Ukrainians done a pretty good job of having a go at them. There is some argument. I mean, the whole problem with Russia is they weren't intending to be involved in a war initially. When they invaded, they thought it was going to be a 2-day to 15-day thing, clear up, change your government, job done, see you later. Now we kind of control a puppet government in Ukraine. Ukraine is ours. That never happened. Then they were stuck in a war they were badly prepared for. Now, if they were prepared for the war, they would have got um, air supremacy, and they would have also knocked out things like bridges. But they're constantly thinking, well, we might need these bridges because we're gonna be in control of this soon. So we blow up all the bridges. But actually, they probably should have blown up an awful lot more bridges and destroyed an awful lot more sort of GLOC targets than they did. But there you go. Anyway, I digress. OPSEC. Like you see in certain places, Kinburn Spit area was all a bit quiet. In fact, Kherson, when there was a lot the liberation of Kherson to the on the right bank of the Dnipro. While they were doing their operations, there was a lot of quiet, radio silence. People, there's very little information coming out there, and that was due to OPSEC, operational security. So no one say anything about what you're doing. No social media, none of this stuff. Everyone stays stum, and we get this done, and that means that our movements and the intelligence about what we're doing does not leak to the other side. And that's really important, because if the opposition know what you're doing and what you're intending to do, then obviously they can be proactive or reactive to a devastating degree. So OPSEC is super important. Okay, DPR or DNR, depends how you transliterate the Cyrillic writing, I think. That's why there's these two. Is the Donetsk People's Republic, LPR, LNR, Luhansk People's Republic. These are the two, not the whole oblasts, but actually the parts that were the separatist parts where they drew the lines on a map in 2014, and Russia sent a whole bunch of little green men, which is all a bit illegal, sent in uniforms without any insignias on them, and it turns out that they were basically Russian troops working in a foreign country, but pretending to be separatists from Donetsk and Luhansk. And this is why you get all the Russian trolls complaining. Well, actually, the Russia sent their army into Ukraine. They just did it in a clandestine way, which is illegal. So don't give me all the whole 2014 blah 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 blah. But anyway, that's what DPR, DNR, LPR, LNR stands for, and they have their own sort of militias that are working alongside the regular Russian forces and the Wagner PMC. Oh, PMC, I haven't included that. Anyway, some more acronyms. Let's go to the FSB, the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. So that's intelligence, your internal intelligence guys, FSB, as opposed to the GRU, which main directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, formerly the main intelligence directorate. So the GRU is your military intelligence, and this is the Russian military's foreign intelligence service, which commands its own special forces, the Spetsnaz troops. So the Spetsnaz troops have been in action up and down the front line. In fact, there's a complaint that the Spetsnaz troops were being used ineffectively because they were just being used as regular troops because they didn't have the capability or the capacity to use anyone else at the time before they mobilized. So they were, not being used in the way that they should have been used, and people were complaining about that. But yeah, the FSB will and the GRU sort of Putin is former FSB himself. On the other side of that, you've got so for the Ukrainians, you've got the SBU or sometimes the SSU, Security Services of Ukraine, and they are presently sort of active, as you can imagine, doing their intelligence stuff around Ukraine and probably infiltrating into Russia as well. We heard recently there was a group of 4 who were killed operating. I don't know if they were SBU, but it wouldn't surprise me, and they were operating in Russia. They are also at present arresting quite a few collaborators around Ukraine and sort of administering justice as they see it to them. You've also got just thrown in RMA. So sometimes you see, is it Vitaly Kim, who is the Mykolaiv RMA, so Regional Military Administration, and he's the head of the kind of RMA, the Mykolaiv RMA. So yeah, going back, this is out of position. Sorry, I added this one in. Oh, I got it in the wrong place. Anyway, let's throw it in there. SEED. I talked about this a little bit already. If you're going SEED, which is suppression of enemy air defenses. If you're going to have a war, or if you're going to invade a country, you do lots of seed operations first. That's one of the first things you do. You gather your intelligence, you do X, Y, and Z, so you have as much information about as possible, which Russia, I think, did very poorly. And then you do seed until you've got air superiority. And if you have complete air superiority, it's called air supremacy. Now, Russia never did their seed, or they didn't do enough of it, and it all didn't go as according to plan, and it kind of tailed off. And so, therefore, the airspace has been contested ever since then. And if it's contested, you can't do combined arms army operations. You can't combine your air force cohesively with your ground forces, with your navy, with your radar guys, with your artillery. All of these people working together. That's combined arms armies. Now, SEED takes out radar installations and surface-to-air missile systems. If you haven't done that, then those systems and radars are still active, which means you can't fly your planes where you want. You are constantly thinking, I'm going to be hit. So the Russians have consistently been flying their planes and releasing their missiles from way behind the front lines because they're too afraid to get close to the front lines because they get shot down. And that's because they didn't do seed. And if you don't have air supremacy, I don't think you can effectively win the war. You can go back to the Battle of Britain and see that as one of the first examples of the importance of that. Germany was trying to take out our air defenses, our air force, because they knew that if they invaded Britain, if they didn't have supremacy in the air, then their ships, their landing craft could just be taken out from above. and because they lost the Battle of Britain in 1940, arguably, that kept the Britain safe from invasion. So it's super important air superiority, and they just Russia screwed that one up. A few things that can be fired from an aircraft who's doing seed operations. Here's one: an AGM-88 harm. So these harm missiles have been exceptionally useful. The Ukrainians have had these for some time now, given to them by America predominantly. High-speed anti-radiation missiles. So these lock onto radiation emissions. So from a radar installation or a SAN site that will have sort of both working together, the missile installation with the radar, and these missiles will lock onto that and take them out. So there you go. Those are harm missiles. Let's move on to more general. That one was slightly out of place. Apologies. AFU, Armed Forces of Ukraine. UA, Ukrainian Army. RUAF, Russian Armed Forces. So just general ones that get used quite a lot. And then a few ones for both sides. So the TDF you'll see in the Ukrainian side, which is a territorial defense force. These are your reservists who are, locally based. So you might join your local reservists, be in the sort of 106th Territorial Defense Force of wherever it is. I don't know, Zhytomyr or somewhere. Someone will tell me where that is. So that's your Territorial Defense Force, your TDF. For the Russians, there are a few that you see around VDV. They're your Russian airborne forces. They are pretty decent, well-trained, or previously have been well-trained units. And the VKS is the Russian Air Force, just as we'd say RAF for the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force. The VKS is the Russian Air Force. So there you are. A few more acronyms to throw your way. KIA, killed in action. You might know that, but you might not know the codes for that, which you see used a lot at the moment. So 200s are killed in action. 300s are wounded in action. I don't know if those are particularly. They might just be particularly Russian codes. 200s and 300s, but yeah, they refer to killed in action and wounded in action. You've got POWs, prisoner of war, obviously, and then IDP, an internally displaced person. So you might get internal refugees who are having. That's happened an awful lot in Ukraine, where you've got an awful lot of people living in the east and south having to move further west to get away from the war, or indeed, become refugees and leave the country entirely. A few organizations here. NATO, obviously pretty obvious one. North Atlantic Treaty Organization started in 1949. Just, the process of taking on Finland and Sweden into the organization, which all depended on Turkey giving them the green light. So this is Russia's decision to invade Ukraine because they were worried about NATO, and they didn't want NATO getting stronger. By invading, they've actually made NATO stronger, and people are giving more money to NATO through increased budgets and increased defense budgets, and it's all kind of egg on your face in Putin's case. OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. That's a large international organization in which most European states, Russia, US, and Canada, among others, are members. Exists to foster security and prevent or manage crises. In this conflict, OSCE representatives have been acting as international observers in areas of active fighting. I don't know if they're involved in sort of war crimes, sort of looking into that as well, not sure. But any organization that has Russia on it, like the UN Security Council, it's a bit of a problem when Russia are the aggressors. And finally, UAH, Ukrainian Hryvnia. So Hryvnia, I think that's how you pronounce it. At least that's what the internet told me. So what is one hryvnia is 0.023 pounds or 0.027 US dollars. So that's £1,000 is 44,184 hryvnias, and $1,000 is 36,664 hryvnias. So there you go, and that's the symbol for it. Every day is a school day around here. So there you go. That is my little sort of trip, a little skip through the world of acronyms for you. Thank you for lasting right to the end if you are still here. If you've already fallen asleep or lost the will to live, I apologize. I may add to this if there are others that I've forgotten, which there undoubtedly are. I mean, like IEDs, duh. I will add to this presentation and then record the extra ones and edit the video, or produce subsequent videos building on this, so it's kind of a reference piece. Anyway, thank you again, Toodle Pips. Please like, subscribe, and share. And I will see you for the extra video later.